Tell me about reading people. I feel like that's also probably one of the many like maxed out expertise that you have. And I'm interested, what all can you learn from reading people? Like, can I know about their emotional state? Can I know about their history? What all can I know if I was just trying to read someone?
I love this question of reading people because reading people isn't quite what you think of it is, what you think of it from the movies and from books, right? We use a term called assessment in CIA. Assessment means that you're always assessing a person. And it implies two things. It implies, one, that you're not making any final conclusions. When you make a final conclusion, that's an assumption. An assessment means that you're not making a final conclusion. You're making a temporary like idea or a temporary theory of how a person is wired. So that's the first thing that is really powerful about assessment. The second thing that's powerful about assessment is that you can actually bring in other people and hear their assessment from their different points of view. And now you have an abundance of information, something that we call information superiority. So, whereas most people in the world are out there making assumptions, they meet you and they just assume something is true. You must be this way because you came from that. You must be this kind of person because you're wearing that kind of thing, right? Most of us are wired to assume based on a snap judgment, but professionals are trained to assess. What are the objective data points that I can collect that lead me to some sort of temporary theory about how you think, how you feel, how you behave? And when you are using assessment, you can start to test your theory. So if I see, like for example, with you, right, Prakar, you jumped onto this call with me. I see your set. I see what you're wearing. There's color all over the place. I can assess that you might be a sensitive person. And you might be sensitive because you might be artistically inclined. You might be very creatively inclined. You have a hairstyle that's a little bit flamboyant. You have a beard that's very carefully groomed. And you have all this artistic stuff around you. That tells me that you are probably detail oriented and you are probably fashionable and you are probably focused on appearing a certain calculated way. I don't know if that's true or not, but I can assess that. And if I assess that, I can start testing that. And I can start having a conversation with you where I ask you questions about the artwork, about the jacket, about the hairstyle. And as you answer those questions, I get more information about you, right? And that helps inform my assessment as true or false. Maybe you'll come back and you'll be like, actually, Andy, I know nothing about fashion. I'm just wearing what my producer told me to wear. Well,
That's
that's
so
that's
true.
perfect. That
Yeah.
answers my question.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that's how we actually read people. The reality is that you read people very similar to how you actually read a book, one word at a time and one page at a time. Nobody holds up a book and says, I know this whole book.
Right.
So why would we think that about a person? We don't know a person. All we can know is what we just read. And what's going to come next is going to be a surprise. We can have some theories, we can have some expectations, but when we turn the page, we should expect to be wrong.
I get it. So it's basically building a theory real time, gathering information, updating that theory real time. And then eventually you arrive at approximately a precise understanding of the other person if enough time and data is collected. That's how you're doing it, right? And
Yep.
and what are you looking at? Are you looking at body language, subverbal cues? Are you looking at I mean I get the aesthetic and sort of the circumstantial part. But like for instance, I was hanging out with poker legend Daniel Negreanu and I was asking him, how do you see if a person is lying? And there is standard stuff like touching the face and that kind of stuff. But is there something more advanced in figuring out deceit in someone else?
I wouldn't say it's more advanced. And there's two questions that you asked, right? You asked what are we looking at when we make an assessment versus what we look at when we're trying to determine if someone's lying to us, right? And the answer is yes, we are looking at verbal and nonverbal cues. Verbal and nonverbal cues can be quite complicated. Whether you're talking about micro expressions, which is what you just talked about when you were pointing at your face, micro expressions are one tool, but then there's other macro level body language that is also very telling. So, as an example, you have a habit of leaning back in your chair at the end of a statement or at a conclusion And that's when you reset. That's when you kind of think to yourself what we just talked about, and then you plan what you're going to talk about next, and then you lean forward. You also have a habit of only having one hand on your desk, not both hands on your desk, right? So you're leaning forward in a way where you're kind of aggressively taking action in the conversation, directing the conversation, which makes sense because you're the interview host. These are nonverbal cues, and these nonverbal cues start to hint at a level of confidence. They start to hint at a level of interest. They start to hint at a level of intelligence. And that's before you even talk. Once you start talking, now we get verbal cues. And verbal cues are not just what you say, they're how you say it. How fast do you speak? What actual words do you choose? I don't know if you notice, Prakhar, but you use some very academic, intelligent words that are not commonly used. Yeah, words that are not used commonly, even by people who are living in the United States or living in the UK, where English is the only language. And you must have at least two languages, right? English plus your native language if you don't have a third. So that means you're using very advanced, nuanced language in a second language. That the assessment there for your level of intelligence, what we would call your intelligence quotient, your IQ, again, we're assessing, but I'm getting tons of information about this based on your verbal and nonverbal cues. That's what we look at. And then from that, we get a baseline. You just had the point click, which is why you leaned back.
I noticed. Yeah. I was like, fuck, I leaned back. I gave it away. I gave away so much information. Yes, because it suddenly landed completely. And I was like, yeah. And so, it relaxed as opposed to before when I was listening intentfully. Yeah.
And think about how powerful this is for all of us. Like, you can use this in a business negotiation, just like you use it in a hostage negotiation. You can use it with a banker. You can use it with an employee. You can use it with somebody whose company you're trying to buy, because people subconsciously don't recognize their verbal and nonverbal cues. They don't recognize what they're doing with their body. They don't recognize what they're doing with their volume, their pace, their speech, their word choice. They don't recognize it because they haven't been trained.
And then what about figuring out deceit? Is there a more accurate way of figuring out deceit? Because I feel like people would be really interested in that.
Yeah, so the truth is that figuring out if somebody's lying to you with confidence is it's not a fast process. It's a slow process. All the theories out there about micro expressions, as an example, those work, but they really only work with high confidence if you are in an interrogation situation where you control the other person's movements. If you put them in a room where they can't leave until after they answer your questions, for example. When it comes to deciding if someone's lying to you in the everyday world, where anybody can come and go as they choose, where there's different weather conditions, micro expressions don't work. Are they squinting because the sun is bright, or are they squinting because they're lying? Is their blink rate high because they're lying, or is their blink rate high because there's wind blowing into their eyes? Like, it's very difficult in the normal environment to trust micro expressions. So instead, what we do is we trust something called baseline. Baseline means that you assess a person to understand their baseline behavior. And then when you understand their baseline behavior, you start looking for deviations from that baseline. The higher the deviation, the higher the likelihood is that they're fabricating or lying to you. And then you have other tools that you can use that are almost all communication based. You can ask certain types of questions. You can give certain types of options. And when you use these tools together, it becomes very clear when someone's lying to you. But it's not as simple as standing in front of them and watching whether or not they touch their chin.
Right.
That's an oversimplification of what professionals do.
Right.